The studio lights were bright that evening, and the audience was buzzing with excitement. It was another recording of James Corden's popular late-night show, and tonight's guest was none other than Keanu Reeves. People in the crowd had been waiting for hours, holding up signs with his name, smiling at the thought of seeing their favorite actor live. Everyone knew Keanu for his kind smile, his quiet nature, and his incredible career that stretched across decades. From action-packed films to heartfelt dramas, his face had become one of the most recognizable in the world. Yet, even with all his fame, he was known for being down-to-earth, the kind of person who would give up his seat on the subway or talk to strangers without acting superior. As the band played upbeat music, James Corden walked onto the stage with his usual energy, waving at the cheering crowd. He cracked a few jokes, making everyone laugh, and then he announced the moment they had all been waiting for. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said with a grin, "please welcome the one and only Keanu Reeves." The audience jumped to their feet, clapping loudly, whistling, and some even shouting his name. Keanu stepped onto the stage with a gentle wave, dressed in a simple black suit, his long hair framing his face. He wasn't flashy, he didn't walk with arrogance, he just walked like an ordinary man, though everyone knew he was extraordinary. Keanu shook James's hand and sat down in the chair beside him. The cheers continued for a long time, and he smiled, looking slightly embarrassed by all the attention. That was one of the reasons people loved him. He didn't seem to crave fame the way so many others did. For him, being on stage wasn't about being the center of the world, it was about sharing a part of himself and giving something honest to the audience. James, however, was known for being the opposite. He thrived on attention, on getting laughs, sometimes even at the expense of his guests. At first, the conversation began lightly. James asked him about his recent film, joking about how Keanu still looked youthful despite being in the industry for so long. The crowd laughed when James made a playful comment about Keanu's action scenes, asking if he ever woke up in the morning feeling like he needed a stunt double just to get out of bed. Keanu chuckled softly, responding in his usual humble way, saying he was just thankful to still be able to do what he loved. The audience adored this side of him, the simplicity, the sincerity. But as the interview went on, there was a sense that James wanted to push things further. He leaned forward, his eyes sparkling with mischief, and began asking questions that were less about Keanu's work and more about personal matters. At first, Keanu answered politely, keeping his calm composure. The audience didn't notice anything unusual, but a careful observer could see that James was beginning to cross lines that might not sit well with his guest. Keanu's calm personality made him an easy target for teasing, and James seemed eager to create a moment that would get laughs. But Keanu wasn't the kind of man who liked being laughed at, especially when it felt unfair or disrespectful. Still, in this first half of the interview, he remained patient. He smiled, nodded, and tried to shift the conversation back toward meaningful topics, like his gratitude for fans and his joy in working with talented filmmakers. The audience loved hearing him speak in his quiet, thoughtful tone. There was something almost soothing about the way Keanu spoke, as if every word mattered, as if he wasn't just saying things to fill time. He didn't need to be loud or dramatic to hold attention. In fact, the quieter he became, the more people leaned forward, eager to catch every word. James noticed this too, but instead of respecting it, he decided to test the waters further. He tried making another joke at Keanu's expense, hoping the audience would roar with laughter. Some did laugh, but others looked uncomfortable, unsure if James had gone too far. Keanu smiled politely, though his eyes revealed a different story. Behind the calmness, there was a flicker of firmness, as if he had decided something. The cameras kept rolling, the band played short tunes between conversations, and the crew moved around quietly, making sure everything looked perfect on screen. To the viewers at home, it might have seemed like a normal episode so far, but for those sitting in the studio, there was a growing tension in the air. They could sense that Keanu wasn't going to let this slide forever. What made the moment more striking was Keanu's character. He wasn't known for outbursts, he wasn't known for making headlines with arguments or scandals. He was known for kindness, for generosity, for being the rare Hollywood star who seemed untouched by arrogance. And yet, as he sat in that chair, surrounded by bright lights and the expectant eyes of the crowd, there was something different about him that night. He looked like a man who was ready to stand up for himself, ready to show that humility did not mean weakness. The first part of the show passed with a mix of laughter, applause, and polite smiles, but under the surface, a storm was building. The crowd couldn't see it yet, and James certainly didn't expect it, but Keanu was preparing himself. He wasn't going to lose his temper, that wasn't his way. Instead, he was going to choose his words carefully, and when the right moment arrived, he would deliver them with a force that no one could ignore. For now, he continued to sit quietly, letting James talk, letting the audience cheer. But every second, his presence grew stronger, like a steady fire waiting for the right gust of wind to turn it into flames. The man who had played heroes on screen was about to remind everyone that he didn't need a script or a camera to be one in real life. The lights in the studio glowed warmly, and the audience leaned back in their seats after the first round of laughter and applause. To them, everything seemed normal: a famous guest, a cheerful host, and a comfortable rhythm of jokes and stories. But beneath the surface, the mood was beginning to change. Keanu Reeves, though still smiling, was sitting a little straighter now. His quiet eyes carried a focus that some in the audience might not have noticed, but anyone who looked closely could tell he wasn't simply there to play along anymore. James Corden, who thrived on energy and quick humor, sensed that Keanu's calmness wasn't giving him as much to work with as he wanted. Instead of adjusting to Keanu's style, James chose to push harder. He leaned forward with a grin, deciding that maybe a few bold jokes would stir the crowd. He teased Keanu about his acting style, saying that he always looked the same in every movie, whether he was dodging bullets or falling in love. The crowd laughed, though not as loudly as James had hoped. Keanu smiled politely, nodding, but his silence afterward spoke louder than words. For a moment, there was a pause. The cameras kept rolling, the crew whispered quietly backstage, and the band prepared for the next music cue. James filled the silence quickly, moving to another comment, this time about Keanu's personal life. He tried to make it funny, but it brushed against a part of Keanu's life that he usually kept private. The laughter from the crowd felt forced, uncertain, as though they weren't sure if it was okay to laugh. Keanu shifted slightly in his seat. His smile remained, but it no longer reached his eyes. He turned toward James, and the entire room seemed to grow a little quieter, even though no one had said a word. Keanu's calm voice carried across the studio when he finally responded. "You know," he began, speaking slowly, "sometimes humor works best when it doesn't come at someone's expense." The words were simple, not loud, not aggressive. But the way he said them carried weight. The audience reacted with a mixture of gasps and soft applause. Some people cheered, impressed by his ability to speak with such directness while still sounding respectful. James, on the other hand, laughed nervously, trying to brush it off as if Keanu had been joking. But the mood had shifted, and everyone could feel it. James tried again, his smile tighter now, determined not to lose control of the show. He cracked another joke, this one sharper, as if he thought doubling down would win back the audience. But Keanu didn't let it slide this time. He leaned forward slightly, his voice calm yet firm, and he looked James straight in the eye. "Respect is important," he said softly, almost like a whisper, but the microphones caught every word. "Not just for me, but for anyone sitting here, sharing their time with you." The audience clapped louder this time, many nodding their heads. It wasn't a dramatic outburst, but it was powerful in its simplicity. Keanu wasn't angry, he wasn't shouting, yet somehow his words cut through the air like thunder. James shifted uncomfortably in his chair, still smiling for the cameras, but the confidence in his eyes was starting to fade. The exchange grew more tense with each passing second. James asked another question, this time phrased as if it were harmless, but there was an edge to it. Keanu paused before answering. He didn't rush, didn't stumble. He chose his words carefully, letting the silence work in his favor. You know, he said, tilting his head slightly, people often laugh because they think they should. But the real moments, the ones that stay with us, are the honest ones. The studio audience erupted with applause. Phones in the crowd began to rise, as people realized something unusual was happening. This wasn't the typical back and forth of a late-night show. This was different. This was real. James tried to laugh it off again, but the more he did, the more it seemed like he was losing control of the moment. His usual charm and wit weren't working the way they normally did. The audience wasn't laughing at every word he said. Instead, they were watching Keanu, waiting to hear what he might say next. Keanu's body language remained calm, but his presence filled the room. He didn't need to wave his hands or raise his voice. The firmness in his tone and the clarity in his eyes were enough. He wasn't trying to embarrass James, but he also wasn't going to let himself or others be disrespected. At one point, James tried to regain the upper hand by making a joke about Keanu's reputation for being too serious. But Keanu responded with a smile that seemed to say he had been expecting it. Sometimes being serious, he replied, is just another way of being real. The crowd clapped again, louder now, almost in rhythm, like they were rooting for him. The energy in the studio had completely changed. What started as a playful interview had become a tense exchange that everyone knew would be remembered long after the cameras stopped rolling. James leaned back in his chair, still smiling, but his usual control was slipping. He knew the audience was no longer entirely with him. They were looking at Keanu, listening to him, and reacting to his words. For a host who lived for the spotlight, it was an uncomfortable shift. Keanu, however, didn't gloat. He didn't raise his voice or try to dominate. He just remained steady, his words clear and his demeanor calm. And that calmness, more than anything, was what made the moment so powerful. It was the calm of someone who had seen enough of life to know when to speak up and when to stay quiet. The band played a light tune to break the tension, but the energy in the room had already transformed. People whispered to one another in the audience, some exchanging wide-eyed looks. They knew they were witnessing something special, something that felt real in a space usually filled with rehearsed laughter and planned jokes. By the end of this part of the show, the tension was undeniable. The cheerful mood James had worked to build at the start had shifted into something deeper, something that belonged to Keanu now. The audience had come expecting entertainment, but they were getting more than that. They were seeing honesty unfold live on stage. Keanu's voice still echoed in their minds, respect is important. Not just for me, but for anyone sitting here. It was the kind of line that didn't need to be repeated, because it carried its own weight. And though the night was far from over, everyone in that studio knew they were no longer watching just another late-night interview. They were watching a moment that was about to take on a life of its own, far beyond the walls of the studio. The studio was silent for a moment after Keanu spoke. It wasn't the kind of silence that came from boredom or confusion. It was the kind of silence that held power, the kind that happens when people realize they are witnessing something unforgettable. James Corden forced a laugh, shifting in his chair, but even he seemed to understand that the mood had changed. The audience was no longer laughing automatically at his jokes. They were listening, waiting, watching Keanu with fresh eyes. Keanu leaned back in his chair, still calm, still collected. He didn't need to raise his voice or argue. His words carried weight simply because they were true. The cameras zoomed in on his face, capturing the faint smile that suggested confidence, not arrogance. He wasn't trying to create drama. He was just being real, and in that moment, realness was more powerful than anything else happening on stage. Someone in the audience held up their phone, recording the exchange. Then another. And another. Within seconds, several glowing screens were pointed at the stage. People instinctively knew that this wasn't just another late-night moment that would fade away after the credits rolled. This was something worth sharing. James, still trying to recover, cracked another joke to lighten the tension. But instead of laughter, there was a wave of murmurs across the studio. A few people chuckled politely, but most of the crowd stayed focused on Keanu. His presence filled the room in a way that no amount of scripted humor could compete with. Then came the moment that truly shifted everything. James, pushing once more for control, asked a question that carried a teasing edge. He expected Keanu to either laugh it off or give a short answer. Instead, Keanu leaned slightly forward, his eyes steady, his voice soft but firm. "You don't always have to put someone down to make people laugh," he said. "Sometimes, honesty can be more powerful than a joke." The audience erupted in applause, much louder than before. Some people stood up, clapping as if they were at a live concert instead of a television taping. James blinked, surprised by the reaction. The sound of the crowd echoed across the studio, and even the crew members behind the cameras exchanged glances. They all knew this was different. That short exchange, just a few words spoken with calm conviction, was all it took. Phones captured it from multiple angles, and within minutes, clips started appearing online. Audience members uploaded them to social media before the show had even finished taping. The captions were dramatic: "Keanu Reeves shuts down James Corden." "Keanu speaks truth on live TV." "Respect is everything." The moment spread like wildfire. By the time the episode aired later that night, the internet had already taken hold of it. The clip was on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube, gathering views by the thousands, then the millions. People everywhere were sharing it, commenting on it, and praising Keanu for standing his ground in such a composed way. Back in the studio, the interview continued, but everyone knew the energy had shifted. James kept smiling, but his usual confidence wasn't there anymore. He tried to move to safer topics, asking about Keanu's film projects and upcoming roles. Keanu answered politely, but the audience was still buzzing from what had just happened. It was as though a spark had been lit, and nothing could put it out. The applause at the end of the segment was thunderous, but it didn't feel like it was just for the show. It felt like it was for Keanu, his honesty, his courage, his refusal to let himself be mocked for cheap laughs. As he walked off stage, he gave a small wave to the crowd, his face calm and unchanged, as if he hadn't just created one of the most talked about television moments of the year. Outside the studio, fans gathered, waiting to catch a glimpse of him as he left. Many of them were already talking about what they had seen inside. "Did you hear what he said?" one whispered to another. "That was incredible." They weren't talking about a movie, or a stunt, or a funny story. They were talking about a moment of truth, a moment that had touched them in a way they didn't expect. Meanwhile, on the internet, the clip was climbing faster than anyone could predict. Hashtags appeared instantly: hashtag Keanu destroys Corden, hashtag respect with Keanu, hashtag Keanu truth. People were reposting it with comments like, "This is why I love Keanu Reeves," and finally, someone said what we've all been thinking. Within hours, news outlets began picking up the story. Articles appeared online with headlines like "Keanu Reeves shuts down James Corden in viral moment" and "Late-night TV turns serious as Keanu speaks out." Commentators on podcasts and YouTube channels replayed the clip over and over, analyzing every word, every expression, every pause. They pointed out how Keanu had remained calm, how he hadn't raised his voice, and how his quiet strength had been far more effective than anger ever could have been. Fans from around the world flooded social media with their own stories of Keanu, times when he had been kind, humble, or generous in real life. They connected his words on the show to the way he lived his life every day. For many, the viral moment wasn't just about what happened on stage. It was proof of who Keanu really was, a man of principle, a man who valued respect above all else. Back in his hotel room, away from the noise of the internet, Keanu didn't post anything about it. He didn't need to. He wasn't chasing headlines or trying to create a viral clip. To him, it had just been a moment where he said what he felt was right. But to the world, it had become much more. By the next morning, the clip had reached millions of views. News programs were replaying it, talk shows were discussing it, and fans were sharing it with captions like "This is the kind of role model we need." James Corden, on the other hand, faced a wave of criticism. Comment sections filled with people calling him out for being disrespectful, saying that he had underestimated Keanu and lost his own audience in the process. What stood out most, however, wasn't James's stumble. It was Keanu's grace. He hadn't lashed out. He hadn't insulted anyone. He had simply spoken the truth in a way that people could feel in their hearts. And that was why it went viral. Because in a world where so much felt scripted, polished, and staged, this moment felt real. By the end of the week, the clip had been viewed tens of millions of times. Celebrities weighed in, praising Keanu for his honesty. Fans made edits and montages of the moment, pairing it with inspirational music, turning it into something larger than just a late-night show exchange. It became a symbol of standing up for yourself, of valuing respect, and of reminding the world that even in the spotlight, kindness and truth still mattered. The studio audience, those who had been lucky enough to witness it live, would never forget the atmosphere in that room, the shift in energy, the sound of applause that seemed to shake the walls, the feeling of being part of something that would be remembered for years to come. They had come expecting laughter and jokes, but they left with something far more powerful, a lesson wrapped in a moment of truth, delivered by a man who had never needed to prove himself, but who proved himself anyway. When the cameras stopped rolling and the late-night show wrapped up, most of the studio audience stayed seated for a few extra moments, still buzzing about what they had just seen. The band played its final notes, the crew gathered their equipment, and James Corden smiled for the last time before heading off stage. But the energy in the room was different. People weren't talking about the usual jokes or comedy sketches. They were talking about Keanu Reeves, about the words he had spoken, about the way he had shifted the mood of the entire evening with nothing more than calm truth. Outside the studio, fans who had been lucky enough to attend were already pulling out their phones. Many of them had captured clips of the exchange, and as soon as they stepped out into the night air, they began posting them online. Within minutes, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok started filling with videos under bold captions. "Keanu Reeves teaches James Corden a lesson in respect, this is why everyone loves Keanu," and "late-night drama you can't miss." The first wave of reactions came from fans who were already devoted to Keanu. They shared the clips with glowing comments, "He didn't even raise his voice, and yet he completely changed the whole room. Keanu is proof that kindness doesn't mean weakness." Their posts spread quickly, and soon people who hadn't even watched the show were watching the clips on their phones, fascinated by what had unfolded live on television. By the next morning, the viral wave had grown into a storm. Major platforms were filled with the video. On Twitter, the hashtag Keanu destroys Corden reached the trending list within hours. TikTok users created short edits, adding dramatic music to the moment when Keanu leaned forward and spoke his line about respect. Instagram Reels showed side-by-side comparisons of James's uncomfortable smile and Keanu's steady expression. YouTube channels uploaded commentary videos titled things like "Keanu's powerful words leave Corden speechless." Everywhere, people were talking about it. The internet had seen countless viral clips before, but this one struck a different chord. It wasn't shocking because someone yelled or caused chaos. It was shocking because it was quiet, real, and honest. In a space that usually thrived on staged laughter, one man's simple words had cut through everything else. News outlets quickly joined in. Online articles popped up with headlines like Keanu Reeves goes viral for calling out disrespect on James Corden's show and late night turns serious as Keanu shifts the tone. Television news shows replayed the clip, analyzing it as though it were a cultural event. Some hosts admired Keanu for his composure, calling it a masterclass in grace under pressure. Others criticized James for pushing too far, suggesting he had underestimated his guest's quiet strength. Comment sections across the internet were overflowing with opinions. On Twitter, one person wrote, "This is exactly why Keanu is loved by millions. He doesn't play games, he just tells the truth." Another wrote, "James picked the wrong guy to mess with. Respect always wins." On YouTube, fans left long comments about how Keanu had inspired them, not just with his movies, but with the way he carried himself in real life. Some shared personal stories about moments when they had seen him being kind to fans or strangers, linking those experiences to the authenticity he had shown on the show. Meanwhile, James Corden was facing a very different kind of attention. Social media users began pulling up old clips of him teasing other guests, comparing those moments to what had happened with Keanu. Threads appeared online criticizing his style of humor, saying it was often built on making fun of others rather than celebrating them. Memes quickly spread, showing side-by-side photos of Keanu looking calm and wise while James looked awkward and nervous. Some were playful, others more critical, but all of them pointed to the same conclusion: James had underestimated his guest, and he had paid the price in front of millions. The reaction wasn't just limited to fans and casual viewers. Celebrities and public figures also joined the conversation. Actors, musicians, and even authors began tweeting their admiration for Keanu. One famous director wrote, "Keanu's words reminded me why he's more than just an actor, he's a genuine soul." Another celebrity posted, "This is the kind of honesty TV needs. No shouting, no insults. Just truth." The endorsements only made the viral moment grow stronger. On TikTok, younger fans who hadn't grown up watching Keanu's early films discovered him in a new light. They created edits of his movie roles: Neo from The Matrix, John Wick, and others juxtaposed with the viral clip. They added captions like, "Not just a hero on screen, but in real life too." These edits gained millions of views, introducing Keanu to a new generation of fans who admired his humility and strength. As the internet praised Keanu, his silence added to the intrigue. He didn't post about the incident. He didn't release a statement. He didn't even mention it in any interviews that followed. He simply went about his work, promoting his films, greeting fans, and staying true to his usual low-profile nature. That silence became its own statement. People admired him even more because he didn't try to profit from the moment or turn it into a publicity stunt. He had said his piece, and that was enough. On the other hand, James Corden found himself struggling with the aftermath. Though he smiled and carried on as usual in the days that followed, the online conversation didn't go away. Every new clip of his show on YouTube was flooded with comments referencing Keanu. Viewers teased him, saying things like, "Careful, don't try that again, Keanu might come back." For a host who thrived on being in control, it was a difficult shift. But beyond the jokes and criticism, the bigger story was Keanu's impact. The viral clip sparked discussions about respect in entertainment, about the way hosts and comedians interact with their guests, and about the importance of authenticity in a world often filled with scripted moments. Teachers, motivational speakers, and even workplace coaches shared the video as an example of how to stand firm without being aggressive. They praised Keanu for showing that true strength comes from calmness, not anger. As the days turned into weeks, the clip didn't fade. It continued to be shared, gaining millions of views across platforms. People returned to it again and again, quoting his words, "You don't always have to put someone down to make people laugh. Sometimes, honesty can be more powerful than a joke." Those words became a kind of motto, printed on fan-made posters, written in comment threads, and repeated in countless conversations. The internet had transformed a single moment into something bigger, something lasting. And while James dealt with the criticism, Keanu quietly grew into something more than just a beloved actor. To many, he had become a symbol of how to stand up with dignity, how to value respect, and how to remind the world that kindness could go viral too. In the days after the show, the internet was still alive with Keanu Reeves's words. Clips of the interview continued to spread, appearing in feeds everywhere, often accompanied by music, captions, and commentary. The moment had become larger than the show itself. It was no longer just about what happened between Keanu and James Corden on a brightly lit stage. It had grown into a cultural discussion, something that reached far beyond one late-night broadcast. Keanu, as always, did not add fuel to the fire. He didn't post anything online, didn't make any statements to the press, and didn't appear eager to discuss the viral clip in his next appearances. When asked about it in passing during another interview, he simply gave a small smile and said, "I just think respect is important." That was all. No dramatic explanation, no attempt to extend the spotlight. It was this very silence that made the public respect him even more. For James Corden, the situation was different. He tried to carry on as usual, hosting his show with his usual energy and humor, but the shadow of the exchange lingered. Whenever new clips of his show were uploaded online, comment sections quickly filled with mentions of Keanu. Viewers compared his behavior with the calm wisdom Keanu had displayed. Some criticized him openly, while others offered him advice to be kinder with his guests. Though James still had supporters, it was clear the balance had shifted. The viral moment had changed how audiences viewed him, and winning back their trust would not be easy. Meanwhile, Keanu's reputation, which was already admired, seemed to reach new heights. Fans spoke about him not only as a great actor but as a role model. His humility, kindness, and calm defense of respect resonated with millions. People began using the moment in everyday conversations. In workplaces, managers referenced Keanu when talking about respectful communication. In classrooms, teachers showed the clip to demonstrate how to stand firm without being rude. Motivational speakers quoted his words as an example of leadership through dignity. What surprised many was how long the impact lasted. Viral clips often faded after a few days, replaced by the next big moment. But this one lingered. Weeks later, the video still circulated. Months later, it was still being referenced. People would bring it up in podcasts, write about it in blogs, and post new edits combining the clip with Keanu scenes from The Matrix or John Wick. It became more than just a funny late-night incident. It became a symbol. For fans, the lesson was clear: real strength didn't come from shouting the loudest or trying to embarrass others. It came from staying calm, being honest, and standing up for values that mattered. Keanu had shown that you didn't need to insult someone to make your point. You could speak softly and still shake the entire room. The legacy of that night stretched further than anyone expected. Younger audiences who didn't know much about Keanu before discovered him through the viral clip and then went on to watch his movies. They saw his performances in The Matrix, John Wick, and Speed, but they also learned about his real-life stories: the times he gave away parts of his salary to help crew members, the moments he sat with fans and listened to their stories, the times he quietly donated to hospitals without seeking recognition. For them, the viral moment was just one chapter in a much larger story about who Keanu Reeves truly was. As for Keanu himself, he carried on with his life as if nothing had changed. He worked on new projects, spent time with friends, and continued living simply, often spotted in ordinary places like coffee shops, bookstores, or on the subway. To him, respect wasn't just a word he said on stage, it was a principle he lived by every day. And because of that, his words carried even more meaning. Over time, The phrase "he spoke sometimes honesty can be more powerful than a joke" was repeated like a quote worth remembering. People printed it on posters, shared it on social media, and even used it in speeches. It became one of those lines that stuck with people, a reminder that kindness and truth could be just as influential as wit and humor. James eventually addressed the incident in a light-hearted way during one of his shows, making a small joke about how you don't argue with John Wick. The audience laughed, but even in that laughter, there was an acknowledgement that the moment had marked a turning point. It was clear that the power of Keanu's calm reaction had left a permanent impression. Years later, when people looked back at memorable television moments, this one still came up. It wasn't because it was dramatic or scandalous, but because it felt human. It was a reminder that even in a world filled with lights, cameras, and scripted laughter, a single honest sentence could capture more attention than any rehearsed joke ever could. The legacy of that night was not about James losing control of his show. It wasn't about who won or who lost. It was about the strength of authenticity. It was about how one person's refusal to be disrespected with a smile and a few carefully chosen words could inspire millions. And it was about how, in an age of constant noise, quiet truth could still go viral. Keanu Reeves had not set out to destroy anyone, despite what the headlines suggested. He had not shouted, insulted, or humiliated James. He had simply stood for what he believed in. But that simple act done with calmness, done with dignity, was enough to leave a mark. And so, long after the applause in that studio faded, long after the cameras stopped rolling, the memory of that evening lived on. The audience members who were there never forgot the electricity in the room. The viewers who saw it online kept sharing it as a reminder of the importance of respect. And Keanu himself continued walking through life with the same humility he always had, never chasing the spotlight, but often finding it anyway because the world could not stop admiring the quiet strength of a man who showed that kindness and honesty were powerful enough to go viral.